Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, raised his son Harry and maintained his business until things took a wild turn and Osborn found himself fighting for his life against a web-slinging teenager. We were told the story from a false perspective and led to believe that Norman Osborn was a monster for trying to protect his business and son while suffering through issues that he was trying his hardest to fight. Let's take a look at Spider-Man, but from the eyes of the actual victim, Norman Osborn. The movie starts with a pre-Spider-Man Peter Parker running for his life after a bus that refuses to stop for him. It's clear right off the bat that the people around him don't take him seriously, nor do they like him, except for Mary Jane, who stands up and gets the driver to stop for Peter. Peter gets onto the bus, and it takes them to the Columbia University Science District. Here, we're first introduced to the villain of the film, Norman Osborn. In a car with his son, he's doing all sorts of villainy things, such as dropping his son off at a school field trip and giving him fatherly advice. You know, the things only a real monster would do. After Harry's dropped off, Norman chases after him, giving him the backpack he left in the car. Here, Norman meets his future foe, Peter Parker. The two talk and Peter tells Norman that he's not only familiar with the work he's done, but that he's written a paper on it. Later, Peter goes on and on about spiders while at the Columbia University Spider Zone. He talks with Harry, who hits on the girl he loves right in front of him. After Harry gets a lecture for talking, Peter swings in, no pun intended, on Mary Jane. He asks to take a picture and she obliges. While taking the picture, he doesn't notice as a previously missing spider crawls onto his hand and bites him. The movie decides the bite is tomorrow's problem and Peter is called away. We cut to our first scene with Osborn's company, Oscorp. A familiar glider is being showcased to an unimpressed general. Osborn is trying to create a revolutionary performance enhancer, but nobody involved seems to be of any help. After hearing a singular test that went astray, the general decides that he's going to put even more pressure on Osborn, giving him a deadline of just 2 weeks. Back at home, Peter steamrolls through his house, completely disregarding everything his worried aunt and uncle ask him, which of course only worries them more. Up in his room, a frail and sickly Peter falls ill due to the bite on his hand. Why he didn't alert any of the Columbia staff that he'd been bitten, we may never know. While Peter has the world's worst nap, Osborn is back in the lab, taking a huge risk for the sake of his company. He straps himself in and begins the procedure. Green gas fills Osborn's tank and his vitals and heartbeat skyrocket as he makes wild noises, causing Strom to shut down the machine. After playing dead, Osborn or something in his body sends Strom across the room. Peter wakes up and it's a new day. He's amazed to find he no longer needs his glasses, but that's not all. He's also ripped. He creepily stares at Mary Jane through the window. He then watches as Mary Jane's father yells at her as she leaves for school with Peter following behind. He then stops and stares at Mary Jane again instead of going to the bus stop, which causes him to be left behind. Back at the Osborn household, Harry wakes his father up after a wild night. A night which he can't even seem to remember. A woman barges in, announcing Strom's death. Back at school, Peter catches Mary Jane as she slips on spilled orange juice. She speaks to him and extremely creepily, he smiles without saying a word. Peter then angers Flash by accidentally hitting him with a tray of food, which causes him to fight Peter, but more like throwing the most predictable punches at Peter and missing. In retaliation to some punches from a high schooler who just had a tray of food thrown at his head, Peter hits Flash with the force of a radioactive super person, sending him flying down the hall. Peter climbs up walls, jumps from building to building, and shoots webs from his hands, or tries to at least. Peter then comes home late, completely leaving his elderly uncle to do the household duties they'd planned to do by himself. Peter talks for a bit with Mary Jane before she drives off in a very attractive sports car. After seeing this, Peter thinks he can get some attention from Mary Jane if he buys a sports car. While looking through a catalog, he sees an ad searching for some wrestlers. This inspires him to go through a montage. Peter has a note-writing montage full of coloring, feedback, and spying on Mary Jane through her window some more. Back at the Osborn home, Norman Osborn opens the paper just to be bullied by the headline. We've heard and seen Norman Osborn a good amount in this movie, but this is the first scene where we meet his alter ego, who laughs in his head before Norman shakes him off and goes back to his day. Later, Uncle Ben drops Peter off, but before he leaves, Uncle Ben attempts to have a heart-to-heart with his nephew, whom he's extremely worried about. And in true good guy fashion, Peter completely spits on everything his uncle says. Peter doesn't even care as Uncle Ben says his famous catchphrase. Instead of thanking his uncle for the ride, Peter breaks his heart and then slams the door in anger. At a wrestling arena in a stupid outfit with a stupid name, Peter prepares to fight Bonesaw. The announcer introduces Peter, giving him the name Peter steals and runs with throughout his career as a crime fighter. Peter gets locked in the ring and puts on the most unfair fight that's ever been fought. Bonesaw is a big man who's probably trained to get as big as he is, assuming that his muscles are natural. His fights are fair and with people who know what they're getting into. Peter, on the other hand, is fighting with the power of radioactive hacker strength. Bonesaw doesn't stand a chance. Even when he puts up a fight and gets Peter to the ground, it doesn't do anything. Peter abuses his power within just a few days of getting them to overwhelm someone who's been training for years to get to where he is. Nice one, Peter. After not understanding the rules of the fight, Peter is upset after not getting paid the money he thinks he deserves. So upset that he lets a thief get away with the money he's taken from the fight manager, even teasing the manager afterward. Not only does he let the thief get away with the man's money, but as the manager walks off in defeat, Peter seems to look proud of what he's done. As he's walking down the street, he sees a crowd of people surrounding something on the sidewalk. As he gets closer, he sees it's his Uncle Ben, who reaches out his hand and then dies with tears in his eyes. Over the radio, Peter hears the location of the suspect and tracks him down, jumping on the car and causing it to turn over the road with a possibility of causing not just one, but multiple accidents. The assailant jumps from the car and runs into an abandoned building, with Spider-Man creeping behind him. Spider-Man attacks the shooter, breaks his wrist, then watches as he falls backwards to his death. He then sits above the city and ponders the fact that his selfish actions got his uncle killed.
Identified object, closing fast.
What the hell is that?
While this is happening, the Green Goblin does a Maverick-style flyby on a military project that takes the jerkhead general out of the picture. While it may have seemed like a power move to get rid of the competition, especially in such an explosive manner, the Goblin sort of complicated things for himself. The general didn't at all try to hide how badly he disliked Osborn. In fact, his last words were,
"Nothing would please me more than to put Norman Osborn out of business."
so one could see why the Goblin would have targeted him. But I feel as if it would have been a smarter move to kidnap the general and eventually convince him to work with Goblin. Norman had lots of money, power, and intelligence, but the government had even more cash to spend and power to abuse. You can't say that Goblin isn't above teaming up with enemies, because later he tries to get Peter to team up with him. The general, obviously power hungry, probably would have teamed up with Goblin, especially if he hid his Osborn-ness. At the end of the school year, the seniors celebrate their graduation. Norman comes to congratulate his son and admit that he was wrong. He then goes over to Peter to congratulate him and gives him some extremely kind words of advice. And Peter simply nods, giving no appreciation. After another montage, Peter, in Spider-Man form, becomes famous. So famous that the head of the Daily Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson, puts an ad out saying that he's not scared to pay good money for somebody that can deliver good quality photos of the web slinger. Peter, continuing his long pattern of using his powers to get ahead in life, naturally gets the job of photographing himself. At least it's an upgrade from his past hobby of spying on Mary Jane. Back in the world of a man who's gotten his success in life through hard work, Norman Osborn sits with the board and discusses the good fortune his company has come into lately. His radiant smile soon fades as he discovers that his company is being sold to the company he's competed with, and his inclusion is a deal breaker. A man who has already been forcefully made unwell is now being forcefully pushed out of a company he started because of the sacrifice he made for it. At a citywide festival, people are celebrating. Peter is taking photos until his spidey senses start to tingle, and he looks up to see the Green Goblin speeding into town. Norman, completely off his rocker, starts flinging bombs at the building. He disintegrates the members of the board. Then, to perfectly capture just how not himself Norman is, knocks Harry out and goes after Mary Jane, only stopping once Spider-Man starts shooting webs. Later, at Harry's home, Peter listens in as Harry calls his girlfriend. Harry is threatened by the fact that he can't compete with a web-shooting superhero. Instead of sympathizing with his sad friend, the distress Harry feels makes him smile. Harry apologizes to Peter and lets him know that he's crazy about Mary Jane and that Peter never would have made a move on her anyhow. Back home, a disgruntled Norman attempts to enjoy a drink. His moment of peace is cut short by the Green Goblin calling to him. Norman is shocked by the things that have been done, telling us that he has no control over what the Green Goblin does when he's in Norman's body. Not to play armed psychologist, but this is clearly a sick man, not an evildoer. As the Green Goblin talks of his plan, Norman fears what he'll do, showing us his true character. At the Daily Bugle office, while getting new pictures of Spider-Man, J. Jonah Jameson's office is blown to bits. Jameson is grabbed by the Goblin, and even after Jameson lies to defend Peter's life, Peter still webs Jameson's mouth shut. Peter is gassed by the Goblin and falls asleep, waking up on a rooftop. The Goblin has Spider-Man where he wants him, unconscious and without a chance to fight back. Instead of killing him, which he can so easily do, he bargains with him. He offers Spider-Man the opportunity to team up with him and points out that they'll create more than they would ever destroy in battle. Peter points out the fact that to get to that power and revenge, the Goblin hurt and killed. But didn't Peter do the same amount of pain to the man who killed his uncle, the fight manager, and Flash? Seems pretty hypocritical to me. If anyone could have understood Norman, it should have been Peter. The Goblin took the noble route here, which was quite foolish on his part. Peter, despite his selfish actions throughout the movie, thinks of himself as the hero of the story. He puts himself way higher than the Goblin, which is why he would never team up with him. Although the Goblin is out of his little green mind, he's extremely smart, and he should know that Peter would never see the Goblin's side of the story, even if the Goblin does think they'll do some good together. The Goblin should have killed Spider-Man the same way he killed the General, who would have been easier to team up with thanks to the absence of teenager hormones. Even if he didn't kill Spider-Man, he could have at least unmasked him. He had the perfect opportunity to discover Spider-Man's secret personality. If he had, he would have seen that Spider-Man was Peter Parker. Also, if he had done this and didn't kill him, he would have been able to blackmail Peter or threaten to hurt Mary Jane or Aunt May, making it easier to get Spider-Man on his side. This is all a suggestion to the Green Goblin, of course. Norman Osborn would never agree to any plan that meant hurting his son's friend, creepy as he may be. In the next scene, Peter hits on Mary Jane, and then as he's leaving, he sees her getting assaulted. He quickly changes and jumps into the fight and saves Mary Jane. Instead of throwing out a quick one-liner and then flying off to save the next citizen in need like he usually does, he stays around and hits on his best friend's girlfriend some more. Seeing Spider-Man hanging upside down in the rain, Mary Jane seemingly forgets about her boyfriend and goes in for a kiss. Good guy Peter is all but hesitant to make out with the girlfriend of his best friend. The next day, Spider-Man does some superhero stuff like saving a baby from a burning apartment complex. The usual. Things take a strange turn as he goes up to save an old lady and finds the Green Goblin wearing an old woman's bonnet. There isn't much weight to this fight as we're looking at a radioactive superhuman fight against a mentally ill man who's clearly gone out of his mind. After a fiery transition, Norman arrives on New Year's Day to a hungry group of people waiting on Peter. A suspicious Norman searches around Peter's room, only for Peter to come in through the door and make a joke about beating an old lady. Although with the way he's been shown throughout the movie, one must wonder if he's joking. After Aunt May points out Peter's bleeding, things are brought to fruition for Norman, who announces aloud that he must leave. Harry gets up and follows him quickly behind. He tries to stand up for his girlfriend, then is scolded by his ill father who goes on a rant. Going back into the room, Harry is then scolded again by his girlfriend and then once more by Aunt May. Ooh, bad day to be Harry. Back at the Osborn home, we see that despite his best wishes to stay sane, Norman is losing his battle with the Goblin. The Goblin instructs him to kill Peter, and although Norman declines, the Goblin brings him to his knees, eventually getting him to do the deed. The deed, it turns out, is to completely obliterate an old woman's room and give her unforgettable trauma for a few bonus points. With Aunt May in the hospital, Peter once again hits on his best friend's girlfriend, and once again uses Spider-Man to get something he wants. Harry, who's been excommunicated by his girlfriend, pretty much abandoned by his father, and stabbed in the back by his best friend, walks into the hospital room to see his girlfriend and best friend hand in hand. This, of course, hurts Harry. He tells his father, letting it slip that Peter cares about Mary Jane more than anything in the world. Norman's eyes perfectly give away what he plans to do. Even while in the middle of an evil thought, Norman fights through the Goblin and apologizes to his son, telling him he's proud of him and giving him a long and firm fatherly hug. After a long talk in the hospital with Aunt May, Peter runs to the telephone and calls Mary Jane, telling her on the voicemail to avoid alleyways and stay safe. The line picks up and the Goblin is on the other end. Parker looks seriously into the camera and does his best Batman impression. The Goblin's plan to use Mary Jane as live bait isn't exactly stupid, but it is flawed. Of course, Peter will go after Mary Jane, so his presence at whatever location the Goblin chooses is assured. But there's also another place you could bet on Peter being: the hospital. His aunt had just been bombed. It's obvious Peter was going to visit her, and more than likely stay a few hours with her, if not overnight. Why not just attack him there? Of course, the Goblin suit weighs a ton, and his glider sounds like a jet, so it would have been hard to sneak into the hospital. But Peter didn't know that Norman was the Goblin. Norman could have snuck in saying that he was just visiting Aunt May, and he would have been in a room with an off-guard Spider-Man. Norman also is mega rich. He could hire somebody to go in there and ambush the room with next-level guns and armored suits. Or, and this is the less humane option, he could have taken down the whole building. But that's what Peter gets for not trying to negotiate with him. The Goblin does his specialty and blows some things up as Peter arrives in full Spider-Man costume. Mary Jane is already in Goblin's possession, as is a box full of children. The Goblin, at full insanity, gives Peter a trolley problem. Peter, putting all his confidence in himself, goes after Mary Jane first, then the kids. He of course gets both to safety, but just the fact that he chose the one person over the probably 10 plus children is incredible. Peter tells Mary Jane to climb down so she can get to safety, and halfway through her attempt, the Goblin comes back and shakes things up. Mary Jane showcases an impossible grip as she continues to hold on, eventually falling off and catching herself just above sudden doom. The children and Mary Jane are saved thanks to some opinionated New Yorkers who keep the Goblin busy. But not for long, as he comes back and throws Spider-Man face forward into a building. Then, thanks to the help of his trademark bombs, back out of the building. In the greenhouse, the Goblin delivers hit after hit to the radioactive super person with nothing but the tech that he invented with his own two hands. Truly an inspirational scene. He eventually knocks Spider-Man down, crushing his web-slinging hands with his foot. After Goblin threatens Mary Jane, Peter suddenly gets a boost of energy from nowhere. Here, we have a very simple story of a man getting too cocky. It's the hare napping during a race. It's Icarus flying towards the sun with wax wings. The Goblin had Peter down for the count. He was weakened, and there was nothing for him to do. At this moment, Peter had probably braced for death. If Goblin wouldn't have threatened Mary Jane, Peter probably wouldn't have had that boost of energy, he wouldn't have fought back, and he probably wouldn't have even gotten up at all. Goblin took a page out of the Bond villain book of saying too much. Honestly, I don't even know why Goblin felt the need to threaten Mary Jane, let alone harm her. He just wanted to get Spider-Man out of the picture, so his excessive talking was all meaningless. In short, he deserved to win this fight and threw for no reason. We'll credit Norman's inner goodness for distracting the Goblin long enough for Peter to Deus Ex Machina the fight. Goblin gets flung into a wall, which crushes him. He comes out with a single hand from the dirt, Evil Dead style. Peter gets him to a wall, and Norman gets him to stop by revealing his identity. In what seems like a moment of weakness, we see Goblin try to plead with Peter and give up. Peter declines, which ends with Norman impaled by his own glider. In his last moments, we see Norman once again back to his old self, as he asks Peter not to tell Harry what he's done. Goblin counted his eggs before they hatched with the glider maneuver. It was smart, and we can't blame him too much as he probably didn't know about Spider-Man's trademark Spidey senses. But if he had only waited a bit longer, he probably could have made an easy escape. When he took off his mask to show his identity, Peter was blindsided, visibly pausing for a second, and Norman seemed to be making a comeback to the decent side. If the Goblin had waited for Peter to give in to his deceptions, he could have made things so much easier for himself. I mean, worst case scenario, he gets taken to prison, which he'll probably just break out of. If you ask me, prison sounds better than being impaled. Anywho, not telling Harry is exactly what Peter does. Harry walks in on Peter in Spider-Man disguise, laying his dead father down on the bed, and Peter refuses to explain anything. Instead, he stares at him and then jumps out a window when a confused and angry Harry pulls out a gun. In the end, Peter consoles Harry as he mourns his father. You know, the mentally ill man he just got through unaliving. Then, once Harry leaves, Peter meets up with Mary Jane. Peter spent a big part of the movie contributing to the breakup of Mary Jane and his best friend Harry, just so when the time came, Peter could reject Mary Jane, making the breakup worth absolutely nothing. If anybody's life is hard, it surely isn't Peter, the man who's used his superhuman abilities to get so many things to go his way in life. If anybody's life has been made hard, it's Harry, the man whose father was killed, whose best friend betrayed him in more ways than he knows, the man whose girlfriend broke up with him for a guy who friend-zoned her. In the end, Harry is left with nothing, and it can all be pretty much traced back to Peter's actions. The Goblin seemed to be impatient and had a flair for the dramatic. Many points in the film could have gone Goblin's way had he just waited a little bit longer, or if he'd just taken the roads that would warrant more results instead of the ones that had the most cinematic value. But perhaps some of the Goblin's motives throughout the film could be chalked up to the fact that while the Goblin is slowly taking over, there are still bits of Norman left in, and Norman is using all the power he can to slow the Goblin down as he continues his reign of terror. Of course, the Goblin wins in the end, but throughout, Norman tries to reason with the Goblin and he feels immense guilt for the things that his alter ego has done. But who do you think is the real villain of the movie? Let us know below. Like and subscribe, or I'll be in your dreams tonight. Have a good night, my friends.